we left off in class in terms of beginning in imperialism and kind of what caused it. I remember that I had left off here in class where we talked about Teddy Roosevelt and the other Jingos, Henry Cabot Lodge, Albert Beveridge, in terms of these are the people that thought that it was necessary for imperialism, that we needed to start gaining colonies, to grow as a country, more markets for our resources, spread our Christian values and other things like that. And those people, remember, were called Jingos. And so we are going to see kind of this almost like the social gospel movement to other places around the world. One of the ministers that was pretty key in this was an author by the name of Josiah Strong, who wrote a book called Our Country. And, it was very ethnocentric, very racist, but he believed that people out there on, these islands were savages, and it was kind of America's duty to go civilize them and to bring them to God. And so, one of the things that happens then is that we start to justify this imperialism. Because, if you think about it, it's really quite awful. We're going to take over these people's political, social, and economic structures. Now, some people believe that this was just evolution. It was survival of the fittest. And so that idea of social Darwinism being applied to imperialism. There was a book by a guy by the name of Rudyard Kipling, and he had wrote it called White Man's Burden. And so this is kind of a theme that went along with these other ideas in terms of the white race is the best, and it was our duty to, as Americans, to lift these savage people up and to teach them English and to teach them the Christian ways and, do all these things that we needed to do to save them. Okay, to save them from themselves. Okay, and so really this was to them a good thing. McKinley, our president, before we had kind of gotten ourselves fully involved in the governing of the Philippines, he had justified it by saying we can't give them self-government. They don't know how to handle it. And other people were saying, well, we've got to Christianize them. They're going to hell. We have to save their souls. So there are all these different types of justifications of why what we're doing is a good thing. Even though I think all of us can look at it now and be like, wow, what we did is really awful. Okay, so here's all the justifications. Evolution of the fittest. It was our duty to lift them up, get them to civilization, give them religion, and spread our ideas of democracy and freedom. Ironically enough, since we're subjugating them. Okay, so even before the Spanish-American War, there were people that were kind of stirring the pot of imperialism as early as, the 1860s. And so if you guys remember, we talked about the purchase of Alaska. So William Seward was the Secretary of State under both Lincoln and President Johnson. And then eventually, that he was able to purchase Alaska from Russia for about $7 million. And guys, if you think about this, that was maybe the bargain of the millennium. This is land that not only is there just like a lot of open land and rugged scenery and things like that, but there's a lot of natural resources, everything from fishing resources to all kinds of mineral resources. Probably if we were to pay for Alaska, before we started extracting all these natural resources, probably worth 70 billion or 700 billion, but buying it for 7.2 million, that was a pretty good deal for us. Probably the best deal since the Louisiana Purchase. Now, why did we want it? Well, we didn't know really that the natural resources were there. Really, it was more of a strategic thing. It was one more way that we could get a European power out of North America, and that got Russia out of there, no more Russian influence. And then we wanted it as a naval base. Really, geographically, it's not that far from Asia. And so we started putting way stations up on the Aleutian Islands that were an island chain off the southwest coast of Alaska. And then later we find that it has natural resources, and that turned out to be a whole bunch of all right. Okay, on to our next place, Hawaii. Now, before I talk about Hawaii, let's also maybe make a place in our notes for Samoa. Also out in the Pacific, way out in the Pacific, pretty close to New Zealand and Australia. And Samoa was coveted by Germany, Great Britain, and the United States. And finally, we kind of basically pay the British to get out, and then we share Samoa with Germany, and we still have, basically, Samoa is still um, an American territory today. And most importantly, we wanted access and control of the harbor at Pago Pago, that we could use as a way station for trade into Australia and into the Philippines and China and Japan. Okay, now back to Hawaii. Really, the story of American involvement in Hawaii goes back as late as, or as early, I guess you want to say, as the 1790s. And at that point, it was just merchants who were on their way to China or to some other place in Asia. They would stop in the Hawaiian Islands before they took off. Now, eventually, in the 1800s, we're going to start to see American plantation owners come in. But before them, missionaries start to come in, and missionaries who start to try to Christianize the native population. And then eventually the plantation owners come in. And once they did, these plantation owners became very powerful in Hawaiian government. Now, for Hawaiian government, they really had a kingdom that was united under Chief Kamehameha. And Kamehameha, he was, pretty willing to let Americans come in there. And I don't think he realized probably at the time how much control they would end up taking. So by the time his grandson is ruling the country, Americans have basically taken over, and they've worked themselves into the government so much so that they have made Hawaii a constitutional monarchy with one of the plantation owners, a guy by the name of Judd. He becomes effectively the ruler of Hawaii for about a decade. Okay, and sorry, I should have put the text up, but this is what I was talking about. Now, in terms of economic system, really, what the South had with cotton, Hawaii basically develops with sugar. And from 1875 to 1890, when the McKinley Tariff finally comes in, there for about a 15-year run, Hawaii really benefited from duty-free sugar being allowed to be sold into the United States. And so, really for that 15-year period from 1875 to 1890, Hawaii does pretty well in terms of economically. The plantation owners are happy. But the big losers in this are the native population. Not only have they, most of them that are still alive, been subjugated to plantation work, but most of them died. It's kind of the same way with the Native Americans when the Europeans came in. When the Americans come into Hawaii, you're talking about smallpox and typhus and cholera and all these infectious diseases that end up being brought, measles, mumps, these things that are brought from mainland America, and it kills most of the natives. And so, they have to start bringing in laborers from Asia, and they just figured that if they did that, these people knew they were going to work. They didn't fight working, and so really they started to replace the native population on the plantations. Okay, in terms of troubles for Hawaii, talked about the infectious diseases. The native people, they resisted pretty fiercely, and so, like I said, the immigrants were brought in. In 1887, Hawaii agreed to lease the very important base or harbor of Pearl Harbor, in which we created a naval base, and we still have today. Now, like I said, Hawaiian sugar, it's allowed to come in duty-free until 1890, so you might want to write this down. In 1890, when America passes the McKinley Tariff, this gets rid of the duty-free, which means the import tax, the tariff. And so now, after 1890, the Hawaiians have to pay this tax, and it just cripples the Hawaiian economy. And the plantation owners, they are just desperately trying to lobby Congress to get Hawaii to just annex Hawaii into the United States. That way that they're, if they're part of the United States, they don't have to pay the tariff on it. And so these plantation owners, you can see one of them up there. I talked about Judd. This is, I believe, Sanford Dole, from Dole Pineapple and Dole Bananas. They wanted something done, and so they started kind of creating an insurrection that would take over power. Because by this time, in the late 1880s, early 1890s, a new force was coming in named Queen Liliuokalani. And Queen Lila, she was kind of known. She wanted to kick the Americans out. She knew that the Americans were causing all sorts of problems for her island. She figured they were better gone than left there to kind of control her country. And so she tried to kick out and nationalize the land. And what nationalize means is basically no private ownership by these foreign nationals. She wanted to kick them out and take the land back over for Hawaii, and kick the whatever plantation owners then the Hawaiian government would own those. But that wasn't to be. And so the U.S. planters kind of formed a revolution. They were able to get the support of the U.S. Marines. The Marines came from aboard onto land. They basically took Queen Lil prisoner. They forced her to cede power. And from that point on, basically, the plantation owners were running the island. Now, Hawaii, for about probably a 7 or 8 year period, was kind of a sticky situation in terms of there are a lot of people in the United States who saw what we did, and obviously they knew it was pretty wrong, and so they were unwilling to allow Congress to be able to annex Hawaii into the United States, knowing that this was just an overt act of aggression. Eventually, though, once America starts changing its tune about imperialism, as the Spanish-American War starts going on, all of a sudden people in the United States kind of forget about Hawaii. They start to see the chance of overseas colonies, and Hawaii becomes necessary in that as a way station on the way to Asia. And so by 1898, it's annexed as a U.S. territory. And then if you're just kind of wondering, it's in the late 1950s when Hawaii finally becomes an actual province or state of the United States. Okay, on to other foreign policy things before we get to the Spanish-American War. One of the things you might need to know about is the Venezuelan boundary dispute. This is an example of us kind of flexing our Monroe Doctrine muscles, even though I'm sure if the British really wanted to, they wouldn't have had to listen to us. But in 1895, there was gold found in the area, if you look on the map there, between Venezuela and basically Guyana. And where the gold was found, obviously the British claimed it. And they said, oh, well, that's ours. And, the Venezuelans said, no, that's on Venezuela soil. The gold is ours. And we found it convenient as a matter of the Monroe Doctrine to say, hey, wait a minute. According to the Monroe Doctrine, this is the British trying to take more land than they were supposed to have. We're going to come in on the side of the Venezuelans. In fact, we'd like to arbitrate this dispute because we feel like this is our hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere is kind of our circle. It's our area of control. And so if you look at the picture down in the bottom right-hand side, this is us twisting the lion's tail. And so, this is the United States saying, whoa, hold on, Britain. We're the ones that control stuff here. And really, this is kind of the first real time that we kind of flex our muscles in terms of that Monroe Doctrine. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine was made in the 1820s. And here we are in 1895 finally using it. So only about 70 years later. Now, eventually, Britain said this is not worth going to war, even though we had threatened to if they didn't let us, arbitrate it. And so finally, they submitted to arbitration, and they ended up settling the dispute, and war was averted. But I think the main thing here is really, this is kind of the first time that we're using the Monroe Doctrine since it was created. Okay, on to the Spanish-American War. Now, problems had been brewing in Cuba since the 1860s, but really, the United States didn't have a ton of interest in like the revolution of Cuba. We had some planters that had land down there that were growing coffee and sugar. But for the most part, up until 1898, we were pretty neutral on what was going on. But there were a few things that started to change our attitudes towards neutrality, from neutrality of Cuba to, hey, we need to help the Cubans get rid of the Spanish. So know that Cuba at this time was a Spanish colony, actually one of the few Spanish colonies that were left of Spain's once great American empire. So Cuba and Puerto Rico would be those two. And in the 1890s, the Cubans rose up once again in revolt and tried to get rid of the Spanish rule. Now, during that kind of revolution, the Cuba Libre leader, the Free Cuba leader, Jose Marti, he was killed, and so he became a martyr. And this is one of those things that kind of starts to persuade us, on the side of the Cuban rebels of, hey, maybe these Spanish, what they're doing down there is not right. Now, to add to that, there came some reports out of Cuba about the Spanish, basically the Spanish leader down there named Whaler, and the sensationalist press were calling him the butcher, like Butcher Whaler, because it was rumored that he was taking Cuban rebels and putting them what amounts to in concentration camps. And so, as this is going on, you also have to factor in that there's this journalistic battle going on in America between William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer in an attempt to gain more readers for their newspapers and sell more newspapers. And they took these stories of Cuba and they just blew them, way out of proportion. Spanish treachery, the Butcher Whaler. And so as more people read this, they started saying, well, maybe we shouldn't be neutral. Maybe we should be on the side of the Cuban rebels. Maybe we should help free Cuba. Okay, so what kind of cemented us to this position? Well, one was the Delome letter. So the Delome letter was written by the Spanish minister in Cuba, and he wrote to his to his kind of like his peer that was in America, and the letter was intercepted. And Delome reportedly basically just ripped on McKinley, said he was spineless and that he couldn't make up his mind, and that he was just basically he was a puppet president. And even though many people in America were saying this too, the sensationalist press got a hold of this, and they're like, hey, wait a minute, we can't say that about our president. And so now we're starting to cement ourselves really against the Spanish. But kind of the coup de grace, the death blow, was the sinking of the USS Maine. So the USS Maine was an American ship, and it was harbored down in Havana, Cuba. And one night it blew up, and nobody knew why. In fact, now we know, as of the 1970s, that there was just almost like an engine failure where in the boiler something happened where the boiler blew up. But there's nobody that did it, really. It was nobody's fault. It was just kind of an accident. But that's not what the Yellow Press did. The Yellow Press, again, wanting to sell newspapers, they wanted to sell these fantastic stories. And so if you kind of look down at the bottom there, crisis is at hand, Spanish treachery, who sunk the Maine? Joseph Pulitzer's paper, the New York Herald, was offering $50,000 for anybody that had information regarding the sinking of the USS Maine. And so as, hundreds of thousands of people read this, they're like, the Spanish did it. Obviously, the Spanish did it. And so this created a situation where all of a sudden America went from being neutral or maybe not even caring to all of a sudden now we want to go to war with Spain. And so that's what we did. And so you oftentimes see this quote from Secretary of State at the time, John Hay, that said, this was a splendid little war because really it didn't take us that long. And we were able to conquer Cuba and Puerto Rico, and then we ended up getting Guam and more or less the Philippines, although we'll talk about the Philippines later. But really, the resistance from Spain was pretty negligible. We're actually able to take over Cuba and take over Puerto Rico with not a whole lot of resistance. Really, and it's amazing because we were kind of an incompetent debacle in terms of organizing our troops. We really didn't have that big of an army at the time. Our Navy is growing, but really the logistics of trying to get from America, and really we kind of debarked from Tampa, Florida, and trying to get to Cuba, to Havana and Santiago. It was really, really, misguided. And so, these soldiers, they had these woolen outfits on, and they were going into the Caribbean. A lot of times their guns didn't work because of the humidity, or sand would get in them. They were hastily trained. There were African Americans that were brought in to fight in the war, and a lot of times the white soldiers would refuse to fight along with them. So, I mean, there was all sorts of the food that was brought over was a lot of times rotten by the time that it got there, or it was, just gross to begin with. And so really, it's amazing that we were able to do what we did with such a debacle of guidance. And in fact, more American soldiers died of disease than they did by bullets. I mean, we had less than 500 people killed in this war in terms of by the Spanish, but over 5,000 killed from disease and sickness and things like that. All right, the major battles of the Spanish-American War, obviously Cuba. We've talked about Cuba and how the goal of the early part of the Spanish-American War is to free Cuba. But as soon as we are able to take over Cuba, our aims start to change. And so later we're going to talk about Puerto Rico and the Philippines. Okay, so Cuba, the object was, if you go down to the map with Cuba there, we had basically control of Havana pretty soon. The object was to get to Santiago, which is on the other side of the island, kind of the southeast part of the island, to surround it by sea. The Spanish Admiral Cervera, he had come in, and then the United States Navy came in and basically bottled him in. And so now it was about surrounding him by land, and then, kind of bombing him by land, and then our Navy would bomb him by sea. And to that end, the U.S. Army was pretty effective in marching up El Caney, Kettle Hill, and then probably, of course, the most important battle of Cuba was the battle at San Juan Hill. Now, even though he was not directly at San Juan Hill, probably the most memorable part of all of this is for the emergence of Teddy Roosevelt onto the scene. And so Teddy Roosevelt, by this time being a jingo, wanting to get involved in the glories of war, he resigned from the Navy as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he became a colonel in the Army. And he was famous for leading his group, his cavalry unit called known as the Rough Riders, in a daring and I would say probably reckless charge up of Kettle Hill. And when they were victorious, then of course they stopped and took a photo. And there you can see Teddy Roosevelt in the middle with his glasses on, hands on hips, right underneath the American flag. And then shortly thereafter, we had taken control of the highlands around Santiago. Then our Navy was able, from Admiral Schley, to be able to, bottle up Cervera and sink basically the entire Spanish fleet. And that's pretty much the end of resistance in Cuba. Now, Puerto Rico was also taken. We'll talk more about Puerto Rico in here in just a little bit. But on to the Philippines. And you should be asking yourself right now, the Philippines? What does that have to do with Cuba? And I would answer to you a whole lot of nothing. The Philippines is nowhere near Cuba. It's nowhere near Puerto Rico, and it's nowhere near the United States. But it was a Spanish colony. And so, again, with the influence of Teddy Roosevelt and others, the U.S. Navy was encouraged to get the Spanish while they're weak, take another one of their colonies. And the reason for the desire to get the Philippines was, again, this is a place where we could have access to Asian markets, where we could use it as a way station. And so the commander of the Pacific, George Dewey, he was encouraged to go into Manila Bay, which is basically the capital of the Philippines at Manila, and destroy the Spanish fleet, which he did. The problem was, once they destroyed the Spanish fleet, they really couldn't go ashore because they didn't have a military excursion force. And so they had to wait several months until the American military could come on land and end up actually controlling the Philippines, which they eventually did. Another ironic thing about the Philippines is that at first they got the help of one of the rebel leaders, Emilio Aguinaldo. But as soon as Aguinaldo realized that the Americans were not going to be leaving and not going to be granting them their independence, then he became kind of public enemy number one of the Americans and the leader of the Philippines insurgents against America. We'll talk about him next time. Okay, but this was a complete domination for the U.S. Navy. And once we take over the Philippines, we really see a changing in U.S. aims. At first, it was just, hey, let's free Cuba. Now it's, hey, here we have a chance to take over some of these Spanish colonies. Let's make an empire for our own. And once we have an empire for our own, holy cow, now we have to govern all these people that we're taking over. What do we do? So now the kind of the flavor of the war is changing. All right, so to end up the Spanish-American War, we have the Treaty of Paris. Yes, that's right, another Treaty of Paris. And in that, really, we gained kind of a temporary control of Cuba. The idea was eventually to let Cuba go. There were some laws that were passed, the Teller and Platt Amendments, that essentially reserved the right of the United States to intervene into Cuban government if they thought that there was going to be a problem with the Cubans trying to govern themselves. So this is just kind of like indirect control over Cuba. In Puerto Rico, we end up taking Puerto Rico as well. The Foraker Act establishes basically what is American elite government rule. So in Puerto Rico, we had, just like in Cuba, we had planters and merchants who had kind of taken control, kind of the same way we did this in Hawaii. Many of those people were put on kind of an upper house in the Puerto Rican legislature. And eventually, the Jones Act is passed, which effectively makes Puerto Rico a U.S. territory. It gives Puerto Ricans American citizenship. But really, they're kind of treated like an unorganized territory. They're not a state. They can't really vote in federal elections, but they do have local government. And eventually, America would kind of get out internally, but we've always maintained that external control of Puerto Rico, and we still have them as a territory today. The Treaty of Paris also gave us an island chain way out in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific called Guam, just another way station and naval base. And then the real question became the Philippines. Under the Treaty of Paris, it was kind of granted to us, it's kind of like continued to us, which meant that we controlled it for the time, but the idea was we were going to give it independence somehow. And eventually, the Philippines is going to turn into a complete revolution against us. And so we're going to kind of end here and talk about that next time. But I think the big thing you need to put down in terms of the Treaty of Paris is now the United States is officially an empire. Okay, now we have these overseas colonies. They have nothing really to do with the people of the United States. Culturally, they are very different, and really it's just kind of naked aggression by the United States. It's a tremendous shift in foreign policy away from non-intervention, at least in the Western Hemisphere. We're going to see a brief retreat in the early 1900s when the Europeans go to war. And then, in 1941 and after, then obviously we've been involved in foreign policy ever since. Up until this point, the Caribbean and Latin American countries had liked us. They kind of thought of us as a good big brother, but really after the Spanish-American War, we're kind of seen as the big bad bully in the Western Hemisphere, and we've been that way ever since. And so that kind of begins what we call, instead of a good neighbor policy, as a bad neighbor policy. We also see this not only as our beginning as an empire, we also see this as the beginning of the modern military system. For example, I talked about in class how the Navy is being built up. During this time, we also see the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which we never even had a reason to have a Joint Chiefs of Staff. But if you don't know what a Joint Chiefs of Staff is, basically an advisory group that is kind of the heads of the major branches of the military, and they make policy. They figure out our next moves to make as a military and where we should go and what we should be doing. So, all right, well, and there you can see by really kind of 1906, I know it's not tremendously clear, but if you kind of take a look at all the different places that all of a sudden we're getting involved in, and now we have, these overseas colonies. All right, that should end it. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you.